Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Automating Hybrid Applications with Appium. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes so you know how to participate in today's event. When you join the webinar, your audio may have been connected via your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to join over the phone, just select Phone Call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. If you have questions for our presenter, please submit them via the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of today's event. And finally, I'd like to remind everyone that today's presentation is being recorded and you will receive an email with links to view the recording and the slides following the event. Now then, it's my pleasure to introduce Wim Salish. Wim is a Senior Solutions Architect at Source Labs. He helps to solve automation challenges by day and practices his passion for front-end test automation by night. Wim enjoys creating his own Node.js modules and contributing to open source projects. So then, without further ado, I'll turn this over to Wim.
So thanks, Andy, and everybody, welcome to this webinar about automating hybrid applications with Appium. And like Andy already mentioned, my name is Wim Salish, live in the Netherlands, and I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at Source Labs. And today we're going to dive into some more about Appium, hybrid apps, differences, and hopefully it will be useful for you so you could use it when you're done with this webinar, when you're back with your customer and you need to automate that hybrid app of your customer. So let's first take a look at the agenda. What I wanted to discuss today are a few points. First of all, I want to look into the mobile applications, the types of applications we have, and then also the differences. And then in the end, we will also get back to hybrid apps and dive a little bit more into the technologies. Then we will handle a subject which is called WebViews, basically a part of hybrid applications. But why do you want to automate them? What are basically the advantages? How can you detect them? And how does Appium work with those WebViews? Those are kind of like the topics that I want to discuss with you. And then last but not least, if we're also talking about why, about some advantages, you might also think about disadvantages. And that's one of the things that we're going to look at kind of like in the advanced topic, because I think every kind of like con also has a fix. So let's also dive into that. And at the end, I also have some exciting news for you. So yeah, hope you will stay until the end of this session to also watch me announce also the exciting news. So like I mentioned, I first want to start with mobile applications. And if we're looking at usage of applications and also especially about automating applications, we've got three types of applications. First of all, we've got the applications that are written with the native SDKs. And I'm talking about SDKs, the iOS SDKs, you're using, for example, Xcode with Swift or Objective-C, or for Android, you're using Java, Kotlin together with Android Studio to build the application. And the advantage of all these applications is you have a very good interaction between your application, between the functionality you would have on your phone. This is just a simple example, our demo Swag Labs app, but you could also take, for example, the Systems app of Android or of iOS. Those are all native applications. Then the second type of application we have are web applications. And if we're talking about web applications, you can just see them as desktop applications, desktop web applications, which are responsive. And with responsive, I mean they can resize based on the screen. And 9 out of 10 times, the source code, or well, basically 10 out of 10 times, the source code will be the same for a desktop application or for a mobile web application. And on your phone, you would open that with Safari, or you would open that with Chrome on your Android device. And the only thing that we need to be aware of in this case is that if we're looking at mobile web applications, the flow itself might differ a little bit. And just to give you a simple example, if you would go to sourcelabs.com, you would see the nice banner at the top on your desktop machine with the menu, and you can just click on an item and you can go to that specific page. And if you would then open that one on your mobile phone, you would get, for example, the hamburger menu. So the flow to go to, for example, our pricing page. If you want to know more about our pricing, you just need to open the hamburger menu, basically an extra step to get into that page. That's basically the only difference when we're talking about web applications and if you compare them with web applications, basically just the flow. But like I mentioned, we've got 3 applications, and you're not here in this session to talk about native apps. You're not here in this session to talk about web apps. No, you're here in this session to talk about hybrid applications. And when we're talking about hybrid applications, we're talking basically about a native application that has something extra. And when we just look into kind of like the meaning of it, a hybrid application can be seen as a native application that uses a WebView object. You then might wonder, okay, WebView object, what do you mean with that? Well, basically, the application you're seeing here has 3 different WebView objects. We've got a Swag Labs, basically loading a web page here. We've got the Sauce Labs WebView. We've got the open source WebView, and we will dive into that later on. But basically what this is, the WebView object, is basically just the WebView browser inside of your application. That's the WebView that you are seeing, that you're interacting with. The bottom part for this application is the native part. But when we're talking about a mobile WebView object, what do we mean with that? Well, what we mean with that is that it's a WebView. It can load and it can display rich web content directly within your app. And then again, you're like, okay, what do you mean with rich web content? Well, maybe you remember what I said in the previous slide. It's kind of like we're hosting a website in our application. That's also what we mean with the rich web content, is we're hosting or we're loading web content inside of our native application, or inside of our hybrid application, I should say. And there are 2 ways of serving that HTML in that hybrid application. The first way of doing that is using embedded HTML. And what that basically means is that you will package your application, you would also package your HTML, and you would push it to the App Store, or you would push it to the Google Play Store. And kind of like the advantage of using, for example, just HTML in your application is that almost every developer who's used at least to developing HTML, CSS, JavaScript, can basically write features for your application, making it much easier to also find developers, much easier also for your company. If you have it like this, where you host it internally, then every time you need to fix something, you also need to push something new to the App Store. And you've got your review process, and that might take up to, 12 to 72 hours before your release will be there in production. So this is also kind of like a downside of embedding the HTML. If you look at a different use case, which is basically hosting content externally, you're going to look at the real powers of those hybrid applications. And when I was working at a large bank in the Netherlands in 2014, we started with creating a hybrid application and basically hosting the content on an internal server. The advantage of that was that it was much easier to release new features, to fix a bug. It was there in production in a few minutes. If it was broken again, we could just do a simple rollback. Basically, just hosting content on a different server instead of hosting it in the app. Keep that also in the back of your mind if you're thinking about hybrid applications, and also if you need to automate that, because that might also give you some advantages, especially when the content is hosted somewhere else. That is something that we will also talk about later on. But if we dive a little bit deeper into the technology about the WebViews itself, how will Android handle those WebViews? How will iOS handle that WebViews? Then we can see the following. If we look at Android, and this is kind of like more the technology behind it, Android uses the Android system WebView. And when you're used to using Android, you know 9 out of 10 times you will get a default browser, which is Chrome. Everybody, I think, already knows Chrome. And the WebView is also powered by Chrome, basically the Chromium engine. The advantage that Android has, since I think it is Android 5, is that the WebView itself is a separate system app. And that means that you can update your Android system WebView whenever you want, as a user even. So if there are bug fixes in that WebView, then you could even update that separately. And also the advantage for Android is that it's not connected to system updates. Unless the WebView is not supported for Android 5, that might be basically a major or breaking change. But 9 out of 10 times you could just get an update even if you're on an older version of Android. If you look at iOS, then there's something different. iOS uses the WebKit WebView. This was changed a few years ago, and you might remember when we went from iOS 11 to iOS 12 and you were already using Appium, you might have seen some breaking changes there. It took some more time to fix this because there was basically a major breaking change in automating those web views. The web view for iOS is powered by Safari, and in comparison to Android, it's embedded in the OS. You can only get basically an update when you update the platform itself. So that might also keep this in the back of your mind. This might be a little bit more difficult for people who are on older versions of iOS. They might still be able to use your application, but if you don't get proper bug fixes also on that old OS, it might affect data that is being shown in your hybrid application. As said, keep that in your back of your mind. But now we know this, you're like, okay, and now that we know the technology, what could we do with it? Well, let's dive a little step into the web views itself, in automating the web views. But before we do that, I first want to show you a short movie about the application that we're going to use during this webinar, and basically the things that we could see in that application. And this is the application. It's a hybrid application, and like I mentioned, we've got 3 tabs here, and we could just interact with this page. This is basically just hosting our SaaS demo website in this hybrid application. We can just click on it, we can go through it, whatever we want to do. The second web view is the SaaS Labs website. When it's loaded, you can see it here. You can just go, for example, like I said, to the pricing, and I hosted the open source application here in our hybrid app. So basically 3 websites hosted in one app. The advantage, if I would basically make this more detailed, I can even interact with the camera if I want to do that, with a microphone. I didn't implement it in this application, not for now, but this is just for you an overview what the hybrid app that we're going to discuss looks like and what we can do with it. So now that we know our application, let's take a look at the first thing that you might want to do when you need to automate a hybrid application. And I guess 9 out of 10 times that you would start using, for example, Appium Desktop. So let's take a look at Appium Desktop. And I'm not going to explain the complete setup of Appium Desktop. If you want to know more about that setup of Appium Desktop, how you can get that working on your machine, let me get back, on your machine, then I will share a link in the next slide with 6 chapters of how to become an Appium Desktop ninja. That could be really useful if you're also starting with automation, but in the next slide, I will share that link. But if you open this on, for example, your local simulator, and you would inspect the source code, you would get something like this. We start on the left with our screen, basically a visual representation of our application. In the middle, you would see the source code. But the source code that you're seeing here is basically HTML from our website, translated into native elements. I can still use Appium Desktop, I can still use Appium, and I can still automate this application. And if I want to go to, for example, I want to click on that login button, you can already see on the right screen of the selected elements that you've got multiple ways for iOS to select that element, to, for example, click on it. If we look at Android, then you would get an overview like this. Again, here we see that HTML elements are translated by the Appium driver into native elements. It's now being shown here on the screen, and you could use selectors as you can see here on the right, or maybe you can even create a smarter XPath selector for it. If you would now need to automate this and you never heard about WebViews, you never heard about how to kind of like automate that, we might come up with two selectors. And if there's kind of like one thing I would always advise our customers not to do is to kind of like create complexity in the automation script. But let's first take a look at that. Let's first take a look at if we just want to use the native view and we want to automate which selector we could use. And like you see here, we've seen the element here on top for iOS. It's the XCUI element type button with the attribute login in uppercase. And for Android, we've got the Android.widget.button and then the resource ID attribute with login-button. I could use whatever selector I want to use. In this case, I just use XPath because then we can compare them with each other. And this is, for example, a way how you could select your elements. You could do that for iOS with the XCUI element type button and then say, okay, I want this element with this specific attribute, and also for Android. And if you would already look at this, this might add some extra complexity. The source itself, like I already mentioned, it's HTML. And we all know when we're talking about HTML that selecting elements in HTML will be the same for Chrome, for Firefox, for Safari, for Edge, or for whatever browser you want to use. And if you look at this, this might not be the best way. This will add that complexity that I was talking about. It would be much easier if you could do something like this. Again, where we have the app source, but maybe here where the app source is HTML. We could then inspect the input elements and then could use an ID or even a more simpler XPath. And if we would, for example, compare that with Android, we basically have the same selector for the ID and also for the XPath. So if we're able to do that, we could make our life much easier. And just to show you this, this is the same source for both platforms. For iOS and for Android, we have an input tag element here with a type submit, with a class, with an ID, with a value. So tons of options for you to get this specific element. Like I mentioned, I'm using XPath here. So with this selector, I can just use it for iOS and for Android, but I think you can come up with different ways of selecting the element for both Android and iOS. So now that you know this, you're like, okay, this might be a smart step. How can we do this? Well, let's first take a look at the advantages. If we're thinking about hybrid applications, and if we're thinking about automating WebViews, then you might remember the thing that I said before. When we saw the native elements, Appium needs to translate it with its drivers from HTML elements to native elements. And that translation costs time. And that translation might also become flaky in, well, let's say during your process, but it can be flaky during your process because they work based on accessibility snapshots. And we might have a caching problem there somewhere. So why do we need to translate something which we can already understand? Because in that translation, we could make errors. So by using, for example, or by using the HTML, it might be faster and less flaky to automate it. Then one of the other things is that if we have access basically to the HTML, like you would have with a browser, you would also have access to the URL. Even though the HTML is embedded in your application, basically being served on a local host in the application itself, you still have access to the URL. And we all know if we compare these test cases with, for example, Selenium, there are a lot of quick steps to go from page A to C instead of going first from A to B to C. So having access to the URL is, I think, a very big advantage. Then if we have access to the URL, we also have access to the application storage, something we don't have when we're looking at native applications or when we're in a native context. And I will get back to the context later on. And if we have access to the application storage, we have access to local storage, to session storage, and to cookies. And this might be very useful, especially if we want to bypass, for example, a login screen. If there's an easy way for you, instead of going through the login screen, just to call an API, get the token and set that token in the application storage, and then go from page A to see, it will speed up your test case. It will also make you focus on the things that you need to do. I think tons of opportunities here. And then also what you could do here when you have access to the HTML is that you can also manipulate the DOM. This is not something that I would always advise you, but in some cases you need to do that, especially, for example, if you see annoying pop-ups or commercial banners in your application. You can just inject a piece of JavaScript and say, just hide those things, don't show them, but don't break my layout, but just don't show them. That might make it easier for you to create a more stable test case. Or if you're looking, for example, at doing some visual regression, then especially with all the banners and all the flashy things on your application, you could just hide them and make sure that if you're doing that visual comparison, it will be done properly. And then, like I already mentioned before, the advantage of basically automating the web view is that you can have the same selectors for Android and iOS, and even the same selectors if this application, for example, is externally hosted. Sometimes you see that an externally hosted application also has some features on the web itself, on the normal desktop web. So you could reuse some methods, you could reuse some selectors. So it opens the door for many, many more options. And when I was doing this investigation already in 2014 for hybrid apps, when I figured out that I could do this by not only looking at the native part of the hybrid application, but I had all these opportunities. I was like Joey here. I was doing a dance. I was like, this is really awesome. This is giving me powers, and this could speed up my test automation, and this could give me kind of like the stableness that I want, that I can really trust on my automation. So when we're talking about advantages, like I said, we also have some downsides. So if we take a look at the downsides, then no, I'm not going to talk about the downsides yet. Let's get back to the downsides in a few minutes. Let's first take a look at how you as a user, if you get an application from your colleagues, from your developers, or from the company that you're working for, how can you detect those web views? So let's start with iOS. And let me start by basically just sharing this is basically my desktop screen. And if you have a Mac and you have the opportunity to open a simulator, then do it like this, open the simulator. If you think you have a hybrid application, also open Safari, and it doesn't matter which website you do. Hopefully it will be Sauce Labs website. Oh, just kidding. Doesn't matter which website you do. Then you go to the menu bar of Safari, go to Develop. There you would see your simulator getting back, and then you would see Sauce Labs Hybrid App. That's the name of the application. And that application has two contexts. It has a JavaScript context, and it has the saucedemo.com context. And if I would click on that one, if I would highlight it, I would already see that the web view of my application itself will be highlighted, like you would normally do that with your DevTools. And if you would click on saucedemo.com, you would get the DevTools of Safari, and then you can inspect your elements, you can manipulate, you can look at the logs, you can look at the network traffic, you can look at storage, you can do whatever you want to do with that web view, giving you tons of opportunities. Now that we know how we can do that with iOS, let's take a look at Android, and especially if you don't have a Mac. How can you then do this? Well, let's start with Android. Let's take a look at the Android web views. Again, we're starting with my desktop background. I'm going to open an emulator of Android. And what I need to do here is when I opened my hybrid application is I need to start Chrome. And again, it doesn't matter which website you're using. This is basically just my starting page. And what I then need to do is I need to start typing in my address bar. I do in Chrome //inspect, and then I would get a screen like this. And if you would now look at this, you can only see, okay, I see Android SDK build, but I cannot see anything. And yes, that's true. We need to do something extra, especially for Android applications. This is something that may be against the things that Appium said in the beginning. If you look at Appium, if you read the docs, and Appium tells you in the docs that you can use whatever application you want. You don't need to manipulate it. You don't need to alter it to use Appium to automate it. Well, if we need to automate WebViews on Android, we need to do something. We need to alter something in our application. And this has nothing to do with Appium itself. It has to do with Android. And let me just give you this link. This is a page about remote debugging WebViews. You can see the link, and I will also share these slides afterwards. But if you would walk through this, you would see that you need to enable a debug flag. So if we enable the debug flag in our application, and we would go back to where we ended, basically in the Chrome screen, then if we would now enable that, load it again on our emulator, and would start typing inspect colon / or Chrome colon / inspect, you would get this. And here you can now see that you have a web view, and that web view is in the application com.saucelabs hybrid app, and you have a pause button and an inspect button. If you would click on the inspect button, you would see something like this. And again, the DevTools. The DevTools with on the left even a screenshot of your application. Well, it's not only a screenshot, you could even use your mouse and swipe through your application. So you basically now detach the web content from your application. You can inspect it, you can do audits, you look at the console log, network traffic, really awesome things. But what if you don't have the proper setup to do this on your machine, because you don't have installation rights, for example, to install emulators? You don't have a Mac to use simulators. How can you then inspect this? Well, we can do that also with Appium Desktop. The only thing that I need to tell you is you need to be on one of the latest versions of Appium Desktop. You need to be at least on 1.18.0, because in that version we support, or Appium Desktop supports, inspecting hybrid applications. So again, let's take a look at that. And what can you do and how should you start? Well, basically, you start Appium Desktop with just a reference to what you want to have, your simulator, the OS version, also the name of your simulator, and also the app. In this case, this will be the Saucelabs hybrid app. If I would start this one, and if I would look just through the source, which is in the middle, you could already see here that there's an element which is called element type WebView. If you never heard of it, this is basically the part where you know I'm talking with or I'm working with a hybrid application. But there's more, because as you can see on the right side, you see WebView context detected. In this case, Appium Desktop already figured out for you that you're handling with a hybrid application. And you see a select box there. If you would open that select box, you would see also the web view, the name, the title of the page, which is Swag Labs, and you see a name. You don't know exactly what it is. I will explain it later to you. But you can now easily switch to that web view. If we would look at Android, you can connect this to your local machine, or you can connect this to applications or to the emulators or simulators or even real devices in the Saucelabs cloud. Use these capabilities. There's one thing that you need to add here, and that is the native web screenshot. And the reason for that is that when we are using a hybrid application on Android, Appium always makes screenshots. And when we switch context, then Appium will use the screenshot method of Chrome. And that screenshot will only be a screenshot of the web view. It will not be a screenshot of the complete screen. So by adding native web screenshots and setting it to true, then even though we're in a web view context in Appium, Appium will create a screenshot based on the complete screen. The complete screen like you see here, where you have your status bar at the top, your bottom bar at the bottom. And if you would then walk through the source, you could also see here that there's a web view, but again, not with the ability to inspect it. And this has to do with the fact that this app was not enabled for debugging the web views. So if we would then load the application again when it was enabled for debugging the web views, we would see something like this. We should have more content. And if we would expand that content, we could then inspect, for example, that username field. And then again, also with Appium, we can now switch to the right context. We have the native context and we've got the Swag Labs context, the WebView context. And maybe the ID that you see here, WebView_com.saucelabs hybrid app, might be like a little bit more familiar for you. But again, we will dive into this in a few minutes because I've been talking now about context and Appium. But yeah, basically, what do we mean with a context? Let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at Appium and context. And let's first take a look at what a context is. And if you would search this on the internet, you would see it's the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or ID, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. It's not telling me a lot here. But basically, what it means is that you've got your native application. You can act and you can do things in that specific native app context. But you can also switch to a different context, which will be the WebView context. And if you would do that, then you would have the powers to use, for example, the HTML, to use selectors. But be aware of the fact that you cannot use the selectors from context A in context B. That's something really which is really important to understand. But if we're talking about context, and if we're thinking about what does Appium know here, well, basically Appium knows one or n context. And you might wonder, okay, n, yeah, well, basically n, it's a number. So it means it could have two contexts or it could have multiple contexts. And let's just start by comparing Appium or by comparing Android and iOS with each other here. First of all, if we're talking about the first context and you're automating an application, doesn't matter native application or a hybrid application, the first context that you will always get back is the native context. Like I mentioned, for example, the tab bar at the bottom of our application. That's the native context, or basically the complete screen around our web view, which is also the native app context. But I also have a way to request the context. And if I would do that, I can already see that there's a difference, for example, for WebViews and the way that the names will be returned by Appium between Android and iOS. For Android, it will be WebView_com and something behind it. And for iOS, you would see WebView_ and then all kinds of numbers. And there's a naming convention behind that. And it's also good to understand that naming convention. The naming convention for Android will be WebView_ and then the package name. So as you can see here, I was showing the Sauce Labs hybrid app, and also, for example, Chrome. Chrome can also be a WebView. And for iOS, it's different. It's WebView_ an ID. And you're like, okay, what an ID? What can I do with that? What is that ID? How can I determine what that ID is, what it's doing? Well, it's something I will get back also in one of the next slides. But first, we were talking about context. Appium is giving you the opportunity to get all the context with a specific command, which is, in this case, get context handles or just get context, depending on which language you're using. And if you would do that in the hybrid application that I've shown you, you could get something back like this. You will get back an array of strings. On top, you would see the iOS, what iOS returning you. As you can see, also native app, and then the web views. And for Android, you would see something like this, native app, and then WebView_, and then the name of the package. So if you would do that during your automation, you would get back this. Then we also have the option to get the current context. And the current context, in this case, can be done with the function getContext. And again, you've got multiple languages, Java, Python, JavaScript, Ruby, whatever you want to use. But with this command, you can get back the current context. So to give you an example, we could get back native app or WebView_ or we could get back WebView_.com Sauce Labs hybrid app for Android. And then there is a last one, and the last one will be setting the current context. And that means that you could switch from, for example, native app to WebView_8891.2. The only thing you need to provide is the ID of the WebView. And that's the one that I also mentioned before for Android and for iOS. That's the one you need to have to switch from context A to B. But I have a tip here for you. If you have a hybrid application that already starts with a web view, then by default, Appium will start in the native app context. So you might need to switch. But Appium thought about this. They made your life already much easier. And they made it easier with a specific command. And if you would look into the Appium desired capabilities, you can see the link at the bottom. You could use a command, and especially this will be useful when your application immediately starts with a web view. Because if you would provide this capability out of web view, it will automatically start in the web view context, and you don't need to program, automate, or whatsoever the switching. So this will make your life already easier. And I will show this at the end of this presentation with some examples. So now that we know this, we know how to switch. We've basically seen all the advantages of using a web view, that it can become faster, less flaky, you've got more powers. Like I also mentioned, we also got some downsides, but I don't want to talk about downsides. I always try to be positive. Yeah, try to be as positive as much. I want to look into the advanced topics. And the advanced topics, in those advanced topics, I hope I can give you some guidelines on how to overcome those downsides. And I want to look into the 3 biggest downsides, basically the advanced tips that I want to give you. I want to give you 3 advanced tips. The first one is that when we're talking about Android, like you already saw in one of the first slides, WebViews are using Chrome. And when we automate Chrome, we're using the Chrome driver. As you might have seen in the past, Chrome driver and Chrome are connected to each other. So if you need to automate Chrome 86, as you can see here in this page, you need to have 86 for Chrome driver. If you need to automate Chrome 87, you need to use Chrome driver 87. 88, well, I think you can do all the math. This is one of the things that could cause some issues, and I will show that later on. Then also one of the downsides is the lack of WebView information. And let me get back to the one with iOS. In iOS, you see, if you request a WebView, you would see WebView underscore 8891.2. What is that? What can I do with that? That might be a downside, but I think we can turn that one around and make it more useful. And then also one of the biggest cons, downsides, however you want to look at it, is multiple web views. What do you need to do if you have multiple web views? You already saw that iOS has a lot of web views. You saw that Android also has different web views for the hybrid app. It has it for Chrome. But how should we use those? But let's first take a look at the Chrome driver versions. If we're installing Appium on our machine, by default, it will download the latest known Chrome driver version to automate the latest known Chrome version. That means that if I would install Appium, a month ago, by default I would have gotten 87, Chrome driver 87. If I would now download Appium, it will automatically install Chrome driver 88 because we're now in Chrome 88. That might cause some challenges. Let's say it like that. It's easy if you already have an emulator or a real device that is using 88, but it might also be a challenge. There is an advantage also in Appium, because Appium is smart enough to detect which version it needs to use. For example, if you have an emulator that is using Chrome driver, or it's using Chrome 87, you also know you need to have Chrome driver 87. So keep this also in the back of your mind. And now let's take a look at a situation that I think a lot of people already have seen when they needed to automate or even Chrome or even a hybrid application. I was doing a test case and then I got something back in my reporting. I saw this message. Appium detected that my emulator used 74, but there was no Chrome driver on my machine to automate 74. And if I would even dive into the logs of Appium itself, then I would also see this message. And this message also gives me a link. And if I would look into this link, I would be like, yeah, this is awesome. Cool. But what should I do now? Well, let's take a look at those fixes, because there are easy fixes for you to automate the version you need to have. And Appium, again, can help you with this. One of the fixes is that if you automate it, it will detect it automatically. And then the only thing you need to do is you need to tell it. But you can even let Appium download the corresponding Chrome driver version for you. If you would read the documentation, you would see that there is a specific flag. If you would start your Appium server with that flag, it will automatically download the corresponding Chrome driver version for the Chrome under test. But there's also a different way. If you have tons of different Android versions, if you have tons of different Chrome versions, then yeah, you can always download that, but that might also take time. That might slow down. So what you can also do is you can provide it and just say, if you start Appium, just use this specific version of Chrome driver because that one matches Chrome 74, but you can also provide a mapping list, a mapping JSON file that would say, these are the Chrome driver versions I have installed on this specific location, map them with this version of Chrome. But what you can also do is, for example, use a cloud service like SaaS Labs, because we already have done this for you. You don't need to think about this. It doesn't matter if you're using Chrome 87, if you're using Chrome 60 or whatsoever on the device that you need to test. We already provided that. And like I mentioned, there's a mapping list. Let me just show you now how Appium will do that. If you provide that mapping list, it's basically also what we do. And if you would look into the logs of SaaS Labs and you're automating your hybrid application, you could see logs like this, where we will look into the Chrome driver mapping file. We would then see in that mapping file, in this case, we've got 50 Chrome driver versions. This was from a few weeks ago, so now we would have 51 because we've got Chrome 88. But basically, we've got a file, a JSON file, with the mapping which version of Chrome needs to be automated with which version of Chrome driver. And if you would then look into the last log files here, you would see that Appium found Chrome bundle com.android.chrome, and it automatically detected that it needs to use at least Chrome 84, and that's also the version that we're going to use, going to map in that mapping file. And if we would look at the next one, you would see that Appium will automatically set to use Chrome driver 84 for you, and then it will do all the magic. So if you would read this document, you can already see how to build that specific file. Or like I said, if you would use a cloud service like SaaS Labs, we already do that for you. So we remove that complexity for you. Then let's take a look into the lack of WebView information. Like I mentioned, our application has 3 WebViews. We've got the SaaS Labs WebView here, SaaS Labs Swag Labs one. We've got the SaaS Labs the SaaS Labs website, and we've got the open source page. So if we would now take a look at Appium, if we would look at our application, and if we would request the current context for each screen, and we would do that, for example, for iOS, then we start with the splash screen. This splash screen is basically the native app. We always start, when we start an app, in a native context. Then if we are in this screen and we would get the context, we would get that area back with the string native app, but also with the web view. Again, that number. Then we would ask for the SaaS Labs website, and you would see you would get a new web view string. And if we would do that for the open source page, again, you would see web view and then with a number. This is a little bit different if we look at Android. And before we dive into Android, keep in mind that the order of these numbers, the order of the web views, can be random. So never rely on a specific number. Never rely on the fact that, for example, the second open page, which was the SaaS Labs website, will always be on the 3rd place in our array which we get back. This could just differ. Keep that in the back of your mind. And then if we would look at Android, again, we would start here with the native app context. If we would then open the Swag Labs, we would get back this web view. And if we would then go to the SaaS Labs page, we would get back this web view. Hey, I'm not seeing something new. I thought I opened a new web view. Let's see what happened when we open the open source. Oh, ships. Again, it's the same web view. What should I do now? Well, maybe if you're used to using Appium, you could do some magic with all the commands that Appium has. And I already mentioned that we could switch to a context. So let's take a look at all those contexts and just start switching to the context, get the URL, and just verify if we're on the right page. So let's do that. So our first page, we open WebView 8891 and then .2. And if we would get the title, it would give us back Swag Labs. Awesome. If I need to be on this page, I switch to the right context. But if this is not the page that I want to have, then I need to go to the next WebView, 1.3, for example. And if I would ask the get title, I would see, okay, this is cross-browser testing. This is the Sauce Labs website. Awesome. Let's use that one. But if I don't need to use that one, I need to have the open source. I need to go back to the last WebView. And then, as you can already see, I already executed 6 commands here, which will slow down my execution. And now I'm on the specific page that I want. But like I also mentioned, this order could be random next time. So maybe there's a different way, but let's first take a look at Android. If we would now do the same for Android, we could kind of like switch to the context, basically switch to webview_.com Sauce Labs hybrid app. We would request the title, we would get back Swag Labs. Awesome, I now know that I'm on the Swag Labs page. If I need to be there, I'm done. But what if I need to go to, for example, the Sauce Labs website? What will happen if I do that? Well, I only have one web view to switch to, so I already was on that web view. So I will definitely get back the title of my previous one. And if I would even switch to open source, I'm not seeing it here. So there's something happening here. With iOS, I see separate web views, but with Android, I only see my application web view and the initial application web view that was opened. I can only switch to that one. So what should I do now? Well, what I needed to do to kind of like understand this is basically just I needed to read the documentation, the get all web context. Because if I would zoom in, maybe you could now also see it here. If you want to have a more detailed way of getting back the web views, you should not use get all context. You should use a mobile execute command saying mobile : get context. So let's do that for iOS and let's do that for Android. Let's see what will happen if we do that. And keep one thing in the back of your mind. This one is already used in iOS for Appium 1. something, basically 1.12 or something. For Android, this only works with Appium 1.19. So if you're on Appium 1.18 and you want to use this with Android, please use a different version of Appium. But if we would do that, and we will get back to our same example, again, we've got the Swag Labs app here. And if I would now request the context with mobile : context, I would get back an array of objects. And that object would at least have the ID. But in this case, it would also provide me the title, and it would also provide me the URL of my web view. And if I would now switch to the Sauce Labs website, again, I would have an extra object here. That object would also hold the title. It would also hold the URL. And if I would do that for the last one, you would see you will get a new object. And the only thing you now need to do, this is basically just one WebDriver call requesting what are the contexts, and you will get back an array of objects. And that array of objects, you can easily filter that, or you can do a find, or whatever Java, Ruby, JavaScript magic you want to use. Only with one call, you now know which ID you need to have to switch to. Much easier for you. Let's take a look at Android. Android works a little bit different because, like I already mentioned, you only get back the WebView ID of your application. You will not get back WebView 1, 2, 3, 4, all the WebViews. If you would get the context for Android, you would see something like this: a large object. That object also has some information about the version of Chrome, your user agent. But if you would scroll a little bit down here, you would see pages, a pages array. And that array has a description, a DevTools, a ID, a title, a type. This is awesome. I get back a lot of information. So maybe I can use that pages array from this SauceCon hybrid app context, if I would switch to that, I just need to do something with the pages array. So if I would now go back to the Sauce Labs Swag Labs website, or at least on the hybrid web view, you would see I get a new one in the pages array. And I can also do that in the open source with the open source. I would also get back a new pages array, or a new pages object. It will be the Sauce Labs open source. But if you look at the bottom, you can also get back service workers, specific types of applications or pages, as you can see it here. They will also be returned. So if you're going to filter through this, just make sure that you're doing the right filtering or finding, and the only thing you need to get back here is the ID. So if I would now need to use this knowledge, and I now need to automate my Android or iOS hybrid application, I can do it with some other magic. Again, I'm here and I just want to switch to this web view. Then I can just say driver switch to context, and I'm already in that context for iOS. If I want to do this for Android, I need to do an extra step. The first step that I need to take is basically using the switch to context. I need to switch to the context of my package. So it will be webview_com.saucelabs hybrid app. Then I know I'm in the context, but like I've already shown you, we are only in the main context, the initial context, which was this Swag Labs website. But if I want to switch, for example, to the Sauce Labs or to the open source page, I need to use an ID. And then in this case, I'm using JavaScript, but if you would search on the Appium page, you know which command you can use. In this case, I need to use switch to frame because I need to switch from handle to handle or from tab to tab. Basically what you needed to do with Selenium. If you opened a new tab, you also need to switch to a tab. Or if you have an application with iframes, you also need to switch to your iframe based on an ID or based on the handle. And this is the way how you can automate this on your hybrid application. So we've looked into like the existence, well, not the existence of the web views, but the technology behind the web views. We looked into how to detect the web views with your local machine or with Appium desktop. We looked into how Appium can help you with this. First, I want to share some exciting news. I think I even got two things. So let me start with that. Like I mentioned, if you're going to do this for a hybrid application, if you're able to switch to the web views, you can make your life faster. And that's always something that we want when we do the automation, especially the managers and the manager of our manager's manager wants to have that fast feedback. So let me give you an example of automating something with the native context, where I would just go into the login page of the Swag Labs app. I would submit my credential, click on login and verify that I'm on that page. If I would do that with native selectors, the XPath that I've shown you in one of the first slides, I would have a script like this. And sorry for people who love Java, this is JavaScript. But basically what we see here, this is a simple test case, and I should be able to log in with native selectors. So I'm using an iOS selector here to find the element, then submit data into it. And as you can see, it will take me 7.1 seconds. This is already fast, so not something you need to worry about. But this is a local execution. If you would do that on the cloud, and if you know a little bit more about how Appium is working, you've got all those WebDriver calls, this can take up to 2 or 3 times, depending how fast everything is. So it can be between 7 seconds and 21 seconds before your test case is done. Now let's take a look at Android. How does Android look like? This is how we can do this again with native selectors for Android. Wait for the username field, then enter the data in the username field and submit the password, click on login and verify until the next screen is shown. Again, 7.2, almost the same time. And again, if we would then execute this in the cloud, it might take some more time. But we can also do this when we're using, for example, the auto web view. If that was the first web view, if the web view was the first screen I would see, then I could automatically switch to it. And then as you can see, I can just use the selectors from the HTML. And if you would now compare the execution times, This is 1.5 seconds. If you would now look into the execution times for iOS, 7.1 seconds or 1.4, or for Android, 7.2 and 1.5 seconds, I think you now speeded up your test cases. I think this is huge. We talk about 75, 80% reduction. I think this is kind of like the news that you want to share with your colleagues. You speeded up your test cases, but also made your own life much easier, because I think these selectors are pretty easy to find with all the tools that I already gave to you. But this is not the only exciting news that I wanted to share with you, because I don't know if you've already saw it on Twitter. Together with Ministry of Testing, we're going to host a 99-minute workshop where we're going to use the knowledge of today, and we're going to help you automate a hybrid application. If you want to join that one, it's free. We're paying for you, so don't worry about that. It's free. The only thing you need to do is just plan some time for it. Join this webinar, because here we're going to use this knowledge. We're going to use a hybrid application, and I'm going to show you how to switch through that context. But also I'll try to show you some kind of like the most powerful parts of automating hybrid applications and automating hybrid or automating WebViews. I try to show you some examples there and let you just play with it in improving the speed even more. So I hope to see you there. During this webinar, workshop, the 99-minute workshop we host together, or basically Ministry of Testing is hosting it together with us. You can register through this link. We will share also the slides afterwards. And then you can also register. We keep you up to date, what you need to have on your machine, and I hope to see you there. So for now, the only thing I have left is a slide with all the links that might be useful for you. And we have, I think, a few minutes left for Q&A. Don't we, Andy?
Yeah, thanks, Wim. We've got about 2 minutes left, but thank you for that fantastic presentation. We have got a few questions that have been submitted in the questions pane, and there's a particularly good one that I want to get to, which is I'm going to paraphrase what was written, but basically, what is the recommendation for the guidelines for automating web views? Is it good enough to automate considering as a web application and running the test as a specific user agent, for example, as a mobile user agent in Chrome emulated device?
I think this is already a very good question, and this already goes back to one of my first slides where I said, for example, you have internal hosted content, you have external hosted content. And one of the advantages of that is that you can use a Safari browser, or you could use a Chrome browser to basically mimic what would happen in your iOS or Android hybrid application. And yes, this is the first thing you could already do. Try to automate it in a browser. It will give you the first confidence. If you would look at shifting to the left, if you first need to build your application, that would take, especially for hybrid or for native application, between 7 and 10 minutes, or maybe 7 and 20 minutes, depending if you're also using iOS. But if you could already shift those testing of the web views to a browser, you might get that fast feedback. Does that mean that you're done? Does that mean that you don't need to test anything else? No, you need to test it also in your hybrid application itself. And then the things that you could focus on there are, for example, gestures. I've seen so many people using basically the JavaScript scrolls to go from an element which is at the bottom of the page. But I've never seen an end user injecting JavaScript to scroll. I also gave a webinar about gestures. Just watch that one, and you will see some tips and tricks on how to do the gestures. But yes, it's a good starting point, but it will not replace doing the automation also on mobile phones.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Wim. And that's it. We're out of time. So thank you again. Thank you to everyone for attending. The attendance has been fantastic. When you exit the webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we'd really appreciate it if you provide your feedback on that brief survey. And you will also receive a follow-up email with links to view the recording and the slides from today's webinar. So on behalf of Wim and myself, thanks for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.